In 1939, when the world plunged into fear and uncertainty, few would have predicted that a nation of barely 11 million people, a country more known for vast landscapes and peaceful borders than military power, would rise to command such respect and fear on the battlefield. Canada had no aggressive military intention, no deep roots in imperial conquest. Yet when war erupted after Nazi Germany invaded Poland, Canada declared war independently from Britain, a symbolic moment where it proved it was not just a dominion, but a nation willing to stand on its own moral ground. Over 1.1 million Canadians enlisted, nearly 1 in every 10 citizens. A staggering statistic, considering the population size and the agricultural, industrial, and resource-based economy that was expected to keep men at home, not send them across oceans. Many of these men were not career soldiers. They were farmers from Saskatchewan, fishermen from Newfoundland, lumber workers from British Columbia, miners from Nova Scotia, and clerks from Ontario. Ordinary people who became extraordinary under extraordinary circumstances. Canadian forces did not rush into war with confidence or arrogance. Instead, they trained rigorously, shaped by earlier lessons from World War I and from smaller pre-war operations. They believed in a practical fighting style, one focused on results over recognition, pushing through discomfort rather than waiting for ideal conditions. When war began, Canada supported the British war effort heavily in terms of supplies, ships, artillery, and later flight training under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which trained over 130,000 aircrew members, becoming one of the most significant contributions to Allied air operations. Canada's Navy expanded from a small force of about 13 vessels to over 400 ships, focusing on the protection of convoys crossing the Atlantic Ocean from deadly German U-boat attacks. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, saw Canadian ships escorting thousands of convoys, ensuring Britain remained fed, armed, and operational despite relentless submarine warfare. This often overlooked contribution ensured that supplies, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements kept flowing to support Allied victories elsewhere, long before Canada was recognized for its land combat achievements. Canadian pilots also served in the Royal Air Force, fighting in the Battle of Britain, defending skies against Luftwaffe bombing campaigns. But it was not in the air or sea alone that Canadians would earn their reputation. It was on land, in some of the most brutal combat zones of Europe, that their true identity as relentless fighters emerged. In December 1941, Canada participated in the tragic Hong Kong campaign, where Canadian soldiers fiercely resisted Japanese forces, despite being heavily outnumbered and out-equipped, resulting in high casualties and many taken as prisoners of war. Although the mission ultimately failed, Japanese forces were stunned by the resistance displayed by the Canadians, marking the first instance in World War II where enemy forces were taken aback at their aggression. By 1942, the Allies needed to test defenses in German-occupied Europe, which led to the Dieppe raid, a disastrous operation that resulted in thousands of casualties, including nearly 70% of the 5,000 Canadians who participated. Though the raid is often remembered as a failure, militarily it provided critical intelligence that shaped planning for the later Normandy invasion, including lessons in tank deployment, aerial support, reconnaissance, and amphibious landing timing. Canadian soldiers learned from Dieppe, hardened by the loss, but determined not to let those sacrifices be in vain. As the war advanced, Canadian forces were sent to training operations in Britain, preparing for the larger invasion, developing tactics that emphasized decentralized command, allowing troops to operate independently and respond quickly to battlefield conditions. Unlike many armies that relied heavily on rigid, hierarchical control, Canadian doctrine encouraged initiative among non-commissioned officers, teaching them to observe, react, and adapt without waiting for orders, a trait that would later prove vital. This adaptability, combined with their practical mindset, became noticeable to British and American commanders, who increasingly assigned Canadians to difficult objectives because they trusted them to complete the mission under pressure. The Canadian military did not have the largest force, nor the heaviest equipment, but it had something the Germans severely underestimated: resilience, drawn from the people. Men who understood endurance, grew up facing harsh climates, and never expected things to be easy. Their psychological conditioning from real-world experience translated into a powerful advantage in combat. They didn't collapse under fire, they adjusted. By June 1944, the world was preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history, Normandy, Operation Overlord. And although many believed the Americans and British would lead the charge, history would reveal a surprising reality. The day Canadian soldiers landed at Juno Beach would mark the beginning of their transformation, from an underestimated supporting force into what enemy documents later described as shock troops who battle like storm units. But to understand just how powerful that statement was, we need to look back further to World War I, when German stormtroopers were elite assault forces designed to punch through fortified lines with overwhelming speed and brutality. Their tactics were revolutionary, feared across trenches, and symbolized tactical superiority. So when commanding officers in Overlord began labeling Canadian forces as stormtroopers, it was not praise, it was admission. Admission that they were facing soldiers who reminded them of their deadliest fighters from the last war, and in the beaches, in the villages, and in the streets of Normandy and beyond, that comparison would prove far too accurate. This is how Canada, small, quiet, and underestimated, became one of the most feared ground forces the German army ever fought. June 6, 1944. The day began with crashing waves, gray dawn, and the deafening roar of artillery. The Canadians of the 3rd Infantry Division approached Juno Sector, tasked with securing Juno Beach, one of 5 landing points in Normandy. Their landing was met with fierce German resistance, including dense machine gun fire, anti-tank defenses, fortified bunkers, underwater obstacles, mines, and artillery fire raining from well-orchestrated positions. Within the first hour of landing, casualty rates in certain units approached 50%, yet withdrawal was never considered. Canadian soldiers pressed on, moving from cover to cover, assaulting concrete fortifications while still under fire. Their amphibious tanks suffered heavy losses, their landing craft struck repeatedly, and many men hit the beaches with no clear path forward. Yet what followed caught both allies and enemies by surprise. Instead of stalling like projections predicted, Canadian soldiers reorganized under fire, breached the seawalls, and began advancing inland faster than any other Allied force that day. By the end of D-Day, Canadian troops penetrated more than 10 kilometers inland, the deepest advance mathematically measured among all Allied landing forces. This initial push was not only significant but pivotal, helping establish an effective bridgehead that would allow reinforcements and armored vehicles to move through, providing security for the following operations. German intelligence began referring to Canadian troops as stormtroopers, likening them to Germany's own elite assault forces, known for their aggression and relentless tactical execution. Canadian adaptability in battlefield chaos was a key reason behind this fear. While other units waited for orders or stuck to rigid protocols, Canadian platoons often responded to evolving conditions immediately, exploiting weaknesses and improvising maneuvers. Their leadership model encouraged field autonomy, giving junior officers and even sergeants the authority to make combat decisions without needing higher command approval. A stark contrast to the German system, which by 1943 had become increasingly rigid due to Hitler's interference. As the Canadians advanced inland, they encountered organized resistance, but their willingness to close in, engage directly, and keep advancing even under counterattack made them unpredictable. To German defenders who often expected delays before counterattacks, this rapid formation and aggression was unnerving. They were not simply holding ground, they were seizing it relentlessly. After D-Day, the Canadian forces were assigned some of the most difficult objectives in Northwest Europe. They took part in the Battle of Carpiquet, among others, involving vicious house-to-house fighting, incendiary attacks, and sniper engagements. The Battle of Caen, initially intended to be captured within 24 hours of landing, extended into a brutal, month-long campaign where Canadian and British divisions fought elite waffen-ss troops. Combat in Caen was intense, often at point-blank range, amidst ruins, rubble, and constant artillery strikes. Many Canadian units sustained massive casualties, some losing half of their men. Yet they held position after position, regaining lost ground and refusing to break. German commanders continued referencing the Canadians as aggressive assault troops, noting their determination to close in and maintain momentum in close combat scenarios. Canadian troops were often tasked with opening pathways or leading pushes because Allied commanders trusted them to complete objectives despite heavy resistance. What set them apart was not sheer size, but operational thinking combined with a relentless sense of mission. Reports from surrendered German officers described Canadian troops as fearless, determined, and adaptive, an enemy that did not fight by textbook rules. Facing them was psychologically draining, especially for units already fatigued from Allied bombardment. Even when ammunition ran low or lines were stretched thin, Canadian troops found ways to maneuver rather than withdraw. By the end of June 1944, their combat performance had established their battlefield identity. Unstoppable under pressure, willing to engage aggressively in tactical assaults, and able to recover faster than expected. This reputation continued to grow as they moved beyond Normandy. In the weeks following the D-Day landings, they would face some of the most difficult operations in the entire European campaign. The Germans were not only surprised by the Canadian success, they were disturbed by it, and the war had only just begun. After establishing the Normandy foothold, the Allied advance accelerated. But as the front widened, German forces attempted strategic withdrawals to avoid encirclement. Their goal? Escape before lines closed and regroup to mount counteroffensives. In August 1944, the Canadians were tasked with a specific and critical mission: to close what would be known as the Falaise Pocket, trapping the retreating German army. American forces drove from the south, Polish troops held the east, and Canadians pressed from the north. Intelligence estimated over 100,000 German soldiers were attempting escape with tanks, vehicles, and artillery. The Canadians faced fierce counterattacks, with enemy troops launching desperate efforts to break out. artillery rained down and sniper fire targeted advancing infantry units. The terrain was riddled with wreckage from destroyed vehicles, blocking advancement routes. Despite this, Canadians held their line and continued advancing with measured precision. Every minute mattered. If the gap remained open, tens of thousands of troops could escape to reinforce German lines elsewhere. Canadians fought under intense fire, utilizing both infantry and armor in coordinated assaults. They captured and held key choke points, preventing enemy retreat. Casualties mounted, but their effectiveness surpassed expectations. They weren't trying to just win the battle. They were trying to end German resistance in Normandy permanently. By August 21st, the pocket closed. Estimates vary, but approximately 50,000 German troops were trapped, around 10,000 were killed, and an enormous volume of equipment was destroyed. This was one of the most decisive Allied land victories of the war. German morale took a severe hit. Many commanders realized that the Allied victory in the West was inevitable. As Canada continued moving forward, they earned yet another reputation: pursuers who wouldn't allow enemy forces to regroup. After Falaise, Canadian troops advanced through France into Belgium, clearing towns, securing bridges, and leading pushes that continued weakening the German front. In September 1944, their operations moved toward the Netherlands, but before that came one of the most brutal phases of the campaign, the Battle of the Scheldt, an operation that would test endurance more than any previous battle. German soldiers increasingly reported fatigue when facing Canadian units, noting their aggressive forward pressure and consistent tactical adjustments. The stormtrooper label became more frequently used in German military correspondence. The Canadians were known for moving fast and never allowing defensive units enough time to rest or reorganize. As 1944 moved into autumn, their mission changed. No longer simply fighting to defeat the enemy, they were fighting to open logistical routes crucial for sustaining the Allied push into Germany. This next chapter involved mud, flooded terrain, desperate resistance, and some of the most human moments of the campaign: the liberation of the Netherlands. And it would reveal a side of the Canadians the world would never forget. After Falaise, the next strategic objective was securing Allied supply lines. To continue pushing into Germany, the Allied forces required access to Dutch ports, specifically Antwerp, which had been captured but remained useless because the Germans still controlled the Scheldt estuary. The Battle of the Falaise became one of the hardest-fought campaigns involving Canadian forces. The terrain was unforgiving: flooded lowlands, mud-filled fields, exposed dikes, and minimal natural cover. Movement was agonizingly slow. Canadian soldiers often advanced knee-deep in mud, wading under incoming artillery and sniper fire. German defensive positions were deeply entrenched, and they knew losing Scheldt meant losing control of a vital strategic resource. The Canadians were given the task others hesitated to take. For weeks, they'd battled through swamp-like conditions, often without adequate rest or rations, constantly under fire with no clear front line due to broken terrain. Yet they pushed forward, clearing strongholds, capturing elevated ground, and advancing inch by inch. Their perseverance paid off. By November 1944, the Scheldt operation succeeded, allowing Antwerp to be used as a port for supplies. Historians consider this victory one of the most important logistical milestones of the Allied Western campaign. Without it, subsequent pushes into Germany might not have been sustainable. Following this, the Canadians moved into the Netherlands, but what they encountered was not just an enemy-held territory. It was a country on the brink of humanitarian disaster. The Dutch population was suffering from extreme food shortages, lack of medical supplies, and devastation from earlier combat. Large areas had been flooded by retreating German troops to slow Allied advancement. Civilians were starving, moving through ruins, seeking food, water, and shelter. When Canadian troops arrived, they brought not only precision and force, but relief and compassion. They began distributing food, organizing medical aid, and assisting civilians even before full military objectives had been secured. In April and May 1945, as Allied operations approached the end, Canadian forces liberated major cities, including Amsterdam and Rotterdam. Dutch citizens greeted them as heroes, not just for defeating German forces, but for saving lives. Many veterans described these moments as the most emotional of their lives, remembering how civilians cried, waved flags, and embraced soldiers. To this day, the Netherlands honors Canadian efforts with annual parades, street names, monuments, and school programs teaching the history of their liberation. Canadian war cemeteries across Dutch land are visited regularly, and families maintain connections with Canadian veteran communities. Canadian troops had gone from feared by enemies to loved by civilians. They didn't just fight, they restored hope. And in those final months, their actions cemented a legacy that outlived the war itself. When German officers began referring to Canadian troops as stormtroopers, they weren't describing equipment strength or numerical scale. They were acknowledging something that could not be measured in vehicles or battalions. They were recognizing mental resilience, adaptive leadership, and unbreakable mission focus. Canadian troops did not retreat in the face of overwhelming odds. They calculated, adjusted, and advanced. They did not fight for medals. They fought to finish the job. And when that job was complete, they did not celebrate. They moved forward to the next objective. This mindset mirrored what made German stormtroopers in World War I so feared: operational independence, fluid combat tactics, and aggressive offense. But unlike the original stormtroopers who fought for imperial conquest, Canadian troops fought for liberation, defense of democratic values, and humanitarian credibility. They became feared not simply for how they fought, but for why they fought. More than 45,000 Canadians died in WW2. More than 55,000 were wounded. For a country of only 11 million people, those are catastrophic losses. Entire generations of families lost someone. Small towns sent dozens of men and welcomed only a few home. Yet they maintained discipline and continued reinforcing the front. Why? Because the war wasn't about personal survival. It was about ensuring future generations would not face tyranny. Canadian troops advanced from Normandy through France, Belgium, and into the Netherlands. Each operation built their reputation further. Their commanders, both Allied and enemy, trusted and feared them. In German documents captured after the war, multiple references were made to Canadian forces being unexpectedly aggressive, skilled in opportunistic assault maneuvers, and resistant to psychological disruption under high pressure. They were described as an army that often moved ahead faster than intelligence assessments believed possible, which forced Germans to reevaluate tactical defense strategies. This fear played into psychological warfare. Facing Canadian soldiers meant facing opponents who would not hesitate, would not delay, and would not accept defeat. That reputation alone could weaken defensive morale. But despite their fearsome identity on the battlefield, they demonstrated compassion off it. In liberated territories, especially the Netherlands, they were welcomed with open arms. Veterans recalled seeing children cheering, even while standing barefoot in mud. They remembered elderly citizens offering flowers despite having little left. They witnessed civilians celebrating under flags that had been hidden for years. Perhaps that is why, beyond the fear and respect of wartime, Canadians hold a unique place in World War II history. They were warriors when necessary, humanitarians when possible, and liberators when the world needed them most. Their story is not the loudest in historical records, but it is one of the most powerful, because they never fought for the headline. They fought so that headline could exist. They stood on the beaches of Normandy. They advanced through the mud of Scheldt. They opened their arms in the Netherlands. And from quiet beginnings, they became soldiers that Nazi Germany feared, not because they were the most equipped, but because they were the most relentless.